Good evening, everyone. Here I am, Asha Nayaswami, my friend Keshava Betts. There he is, and he's going to chant for us after we pray. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, humbly we bow to all. Dear Swamiji, help us to understand your words, more deeply your consciousness behind your words. Help us to rise to the level of understanding where happiness and bliss becomes our natural state. Help us to see past the fluctuations of this world to the unchanging reality of your presence with us. We are your children. Comfort us, guide us, bless us, bring us home to thee. Om, peace. Amen.
I want only thee, Lord, thee, only thee. 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 I want only thee, Lord, thee, only thee.
Let's meditate now for a few minutes. Oh, peace. Amen. I'm going to shut a window here, which is both cold and noisy. There. It's got it. We are in November 2020, and the coronavirus is suddenly having a second childhood. It's really looping about. So we had windows open with people, anybody in the house. It's it's a memorable time. I mean, everybody said this would happen, that there would be a winter surge, but no one really wants to believe it. And so here we are again. Our county just went into the purple tier in California, which we were starting to bring people into our church, and now we can't again. But many people in the world have had to face difficulties far more arduous than this one. But still, Divine Mother is asking a lot of all of us right now. So let's talk a little bit about divine things, and that will cheer us all up and give us courage. We are now into another section of this book. We just finished the section called Yogic Techniques, and now we're in the section called Avatar. To put it mildly, I'm above my pay grade in this particular section, so we're going to be having to work with what Swamiji said as best we can, trying to understand a level of realization that is way beyond my thinking. But nonetheless, we have avatars who guide our path, and it is something that we're all really trying to understand. The word avatar has assumed another meaning in English, which is exceedingly unfortunate. I guess it's the sort of the persona that you create for what things that you're doing online. I don't really, I've been so mortally offended by the taking over of that word, which it's a very sacred and it's a very profoundly important spiritual word, and now it's just become something that people talk about in different ways. But it's not necessary for me to be offended, it's just a fact. But the real meaning of the word avatar, the original meaning, the Sanskrit meaning, is descent of spirit. And it refers to a supremely free soul who, out of compassion and the desire to serve humanity, takes human form. It's what Krishna was referring to when he says, whenever virtue declines and vice predominates, I, the infinite spirit, manifest in human form to drive away the darkness and restore the light, to act against a-dharma and bring dharma back in. So now it just means a personality that anybody assumes that becomes their alternate personality. This is the way language is. It has, the avatars are not touched by it. It's just language. So I have to let it go too. So this is January 31st, 1978. Levels of spiritual realization. So somebody's asked Swami these questions because none of us can really understand this. Swami answers these questions more fully especially in the Bhagavad Gita commentary, the essence of the Bhagavad Gita. But in 1978, he hadn't written that book yet, and so Swami's explaining it. One can be enlightened before he becomes a siddha. S-I-D-D-H-A, these are Sanskrit words, becomes a siddha. A siddha, by Master's definition, is a fully liberated being. One is a jivan mukta, or enlightened master, with the need still to work out some past karma before he becomes a siddha. This is, okay. Now a siddha is someone who is supremely free. A jivan mukta is someone who is fully enlightened, and I don't know how to understand these, but this is how Swami says it. Fully enlightened, fully God realized, but they have there's some karma remaining, and they allow that karma to run. Jivan mukta means freed while living. Living in a human body, living as a jiva, but mukta means free. So Swamiji, in a conversation with Master, he doesn't bring this into this letter, but in a conversation with Master, which Swami reported somewhere else, he said, the Master said, a Jivan Mukta still has some karma, but at any point, the Jivan Mukta could simply dissolve that karma by the power of his will. And Swami said, well, why doesn't he do that? And Master said, because sometimes the Jivan Mukta is content to let that karma continue to run because, quote, it gives him an excuse to come back and keep helping people. But at any point he chooses, he can dissolve that karma, and then he becomes completely free, a siddha. In the essence of the Bhagavad Gita commentary that Swami wrote, there's a section in there somewhere where Swami talks about how a Jivan Mukta can meditate The way Swami puts it, and again, I'm beyond my pay grade, so I just have to do the best I can, that the Jivan Mukta has to dissolve any identification he has, even with any incarnation that he ever lived. He has to see that God was the doer in all of that. And so Swami gives instructions in the essence of the Bhagavad Gita for how a Jivan Mukta can visualize and meditate and dissolve all that remaining karma and become a siddha. When I read that in the manuscript that Swami was writing, my comment to him was, this is not going to apply to very many of your readers. Swami answered me very seriously, as he often did when I'd made a flippant remark. He didn't go with the flippant. He said, that's true, but those to whom it does apply will find it very useful. And that was sort of how he left it at that point, because I don't think it was above his pay grade. It was just above mine. So, one can be enlightened. See, the point is here, and this is where it begins to matter. How much realization do you have? Because this would become a discussion like, if Swami, and sometimes it was very specific, if Swami is not a siddha, is he qualified to guide us spiritually? Do you have to be an avatar before I'm going to listen to you? And that would be sort of how it would come out. And so Swami was also explaining this, because people ask these questions, because in our position, explaining these teachings, people would ask us. So Swami tried to explain to us that you can be God realized, and there's still gradations of God realization, but the enlightenment is there, and that you have much to give and you can help people. So then Swami says, masters are not all equal in outward expression, but all are equal in God. Avatars, moreover, are more than siddhas. An avatar is a descended master, one who, after attaining full liberation, comes back to earth for the salvation of many. So, for example, a Jivan Mukta, who liberated himself from all karma in this lifetime and becomes a siddha, after he leaves this body, he leaves this body supremely free, and then if he chooses to reincarnate, he will return as an avatar, because he's descending from a state of perfection. There's nothing left. There's no residual karma like the Jivan Mukta has. So that's why the word descent, avatar includes the word descent, because it's from a stage of perfection. Sometimes people will talk about ascended masters, like someone who attains siddha is ascending up to becoming a siddha. An avatar is descending from that perfect state. These are all just words, but there they are. More divine power flows through an avatar, but greatness must in any case be judged primarily by what people do. All masters are equal in God, for example, but all, even avatars, may be judged outwardly, at least in terms of their missions. This has nothing to do with their inner stature, and that's the point Swami's trying to make. The state of realization can be present in many different expressions. And this is the issue that, again, people are always saying, well, if you're not an avatar, or if I need an avatar, I'm not going to listen to anyone but an avatar, because anyone else might be guided by ego. I remember, and this was specific to Swamiji, this woman, friend of mine, was getting herself a little tangled up in the question of whether or not she should listen to Swami in a particular instance. And he asked me to try to talk to her, because he didn't feel it was appropriate for him to try to speak about himself. So he asked me to talk to her. It was interesting. I'll just give you the other part of it. I was a little hesitant. I wasn't sure whether I could bring up the issue. I just wasn't sure. This was in the early 70s. And she and I were on a long car ride together. We were probably driving to San Francisco for some reason. And it was an interesting lesson for me in attunement and in getting guidance, because there I was, and Swami had wanted me to take the opportunity, if I could find it, to speak to her, but I didn't want to speak to her unless she was receptive. So we're in the car and we're silent together, and I basically said, Divine Mother, if you want this conversation to happen, then you need to do something. I had really just scarcely prayed that when she turned to me and brought up the very situation that Swamiji had asked me to discuss with her. She initiated the conversation, which was a very good lesson to me, which is if you're pushing it with your ego, maybe you shouldn't. You have to let Divine Mother make sure that what's being said is her will. So in the conversation that I had with her, I'm just talking specifically, and she had an opinion and Swami had a different one. I just said, overall, if you were a betting person, who do you think is more likely to be acting from ego, Swamiji or you? And she laughed because she knew she'd been seeing Swamiji for many years, and she knew how extraordinarily capable he was of putting aside whatever preferences he might have in favor of what was correct. And she was just a very, 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 very fine devotee. She laughed and said, I think that I would rather bet on him than on myself. I said, yeah, I think that would be wise. And that was sort of how we settled the issue. So, according to my understanding, Jesus and Lahiri Mahashaya were both avatars and were therefore equal in spiritual realization. Swami is using that as an example because the life of Jesus was so dramatic and so huge on the pages of history. The life of Lahiri Mahashaya was absolutely central to the bringing in of Dwapara, but the drama and the splash across history, it's sort of hard to see. Maybe Lahiri Mahashaya over time, as the restorer of the Kriya Yoga line, will come to gain that kind of notoriety. But you can certainly see that their mission was different. But Swami says they were equal in spiritual realization. So just using those two as an example, or the life of Sri Yukteswar, which was even in many ways more obscure than Lahiri's in the number of people that Sri Yukteswar's life touched. However, in training master, he touched millions. So it's a little hard to sort of put it all together. But what Swami says, equal in divine stature. So even an avatar, even though they can all be equal in God, the greatness will be the greatness of their mission, which is the impact on civilization, on the direction of the planet, which Buddha and Krishna and Jesus, they all completely defined the direction of the planet, and so that's quite an extraordinary mission. I believe that the followers of the different paths to God will one day live in greater harmony than they do today. It depends on the spiritual development of the world as a whole. Religion truly, of course, is not to blame. It is only man, with his human limitations, who sees differences even among teachings that preach basic oneness. Of course, this is the folly. The avatars see it all the same. And then people come along and they want to make their own the best, or they need to make their own the best so that they'll feel safe in following it. And so even when the teachers teach oneness, Swami Kriyananda laughed because Sri Ramakrishna, at the end of the 1800s, he was an avatar. And one of his fundamental missions, which he demonstrated in an extraordinary way in his own life, was that all paths lead to the same goal. And Ramakrishna was an exceedingly eccentric character, and during his life there was a lot of controversy as to whether he was an avatar or a madman, because he followed many different paths. He became a devotee of Jesus for a time. He became a devotee of Krishna in the person of Radha, and dressed in women's clothes, and actually lived with the women in there. We go into the women's. There were women who were kept separate, and he would just go and be with the women dressed in women's clothes. He followed the devotion of Hanuman for Rama. Hanuman was a monkey devotee, and he tied his dhoti like a tail, and he insisted on only eating fruit, and he spent time in the trees. And he followed each one of these and various other, sects of Hinduism and the path of the Buddha. He practiced the teachings until he reached the same state of realization through each path. Because he was there to be able to speak from his own experience that all paths lead to the same goal. So his tremendous message, which especially in the 1880s was not commonly known, not commonly accepted, because in the age of Kali Yuga, which we were just coming out of, everything is separated. But in the age of Dwapara Yuga, where energy and consciousness are the defining forces, Master said self-realization has come to unite all religions. And he didn't mean self-realization church. He meant the fact of self-realization, that all paths lead to self-realization. And then we understand that we just come from different angles to the same goal. Now, after Ramakrishna died, some of his disciples started saying, yes, he taught the oneness of all paths, but because he was the first one to teach the oneness of all paths, he was the greatest. And Swami just laughed at, just human ignorance. Ramakrishna's trying to equalize and change the competition, and then his followers, out of well-intended but misplaced loyalty, try to elevate him above all the masters because he said it first. And so it goes. And so Swami says it's not religion that's to blame, but it won't change until the overall consciousness of the planet goes up. And it is going up, but not that fast. So it's going to take us a while before we really get there. Okay. Letter from June 10th, 1987. Asked whether certain omissions in Yogananda's writings might have been influenced by delusion. In other words, if Master, didn't address certain issues or address them in a way that this man thought was incorrect, or this person thought was incorrect, was Yogananda himself simply not wise enough to know? So Swami writes, the consciousness of the Master is not influenced by delusion, but he may not be aware on a conscious level of many of the currents of contemporary philosophical thought. So the nature of the complaint must have been, didn't Master know that? Psychology says this, or medicine says that. So what he was asserting was not consistent with these ideas or that idea. Why didn't he take into account, this discovery? That's reading between the lines. That's what I think he was talking about. Certain omissions in Master's teachings, that he didn't address certain things. Swami says he may not have been aware on a conscious level of certain currents of contemporary thought. Now, we're dealing with the Master's state of enlightenment and then his knowledge about modern life. But he says, Swami says, but I have been amazed at how perfectly Yogananda addressed and resolved in his life and teachings issues which I very much doubt he had ever studied. For example, I was recently reading some of the great controversies in Christian theology and realized that Yogananda, more than any writer before him, shed light on those issues, even though he himself was no scholar. So academicians say, well, in this verse of the Bible it says that, and this heresy said this, and then this theologian said this in return, and all of these sort of conflicts and controversies keep going. And Swami said, I'm sure that Master didn't read all those treatises or discuss all those theological ideas, but he cut right to the heart of the matter. He doesn't give us examples here, but he cut right to the heart of the matter, and with his state of consciousness was able to resolve issues that mere academicians and intellectuals arguing with each other couldn't possibly respond to. Swamiji, in his book, The Revelations of Christ, the fundamental premise of that book is quite simply, who has the right to speak, to say what Jesus really meant? He said, only those who share his consciousness. He said, divinity students and priests and novelists and historians and academicians, they can all speculate, but the Master can speak. Recently in some teaching that I was doing, some talking about Jesus and some of his disciples, Mary Magdalene and various others, there were certain premises that I've just always accepted as true because I learned them from Swami and I read them in Master's writings. But nowadays people are reviewing and revising lots of different ideas. And whether Mary Magdalene was in fact a courtesan, whether Mary Magdalene and the sister of Mary and of Margaret and Lazarus was the same as Mary Magdalene, those were specific questions. And I received, because I just made those statements, I received a lot of challenge, and I had to go back. And I actually sort of reviewed, the things that are coming out more modern, undermining both of those premises. And I also had to go back and ask myself, where did I first learn this? And I found sources in both Swamiji's writing and in Master's words that confirmed what I'd said. And it also, what I found was that for hundreds of years, these were the traditions. And then in the last few decades, people have decided that they're not true anymore. But it's not revelation, it's just what people are saying. I'm going to just quietly stick with what I learned from Swamiji because I feel that that's more valid. That's a more valid way to, for me to go, at least. And I don't fault people for trying to understand things differently. But this is what Swami is saying. Master may not have followed all the trends, but nonetheless, he understood the principles. And the things I talked about, well, they're sort of details, but not really. There's a great deal of story that goes on around them. I feel unfortunate that I have to face controversy when I'm really wanting to just inspire. But this is the age in which we live. And also in Revelations of Christ, Swami talks about one of the reasons he felt strongly to write it was he said people are just, he talked about even novelists. Novelists are just rewriting the story of Jesus, just making a different story out of it. There was one novel that's very famous that was very, very sold a lot of copies. Swami was quite, he felt it was profoundly irresponsible to just create. And the story was about, the bloodline of Jesus. Jesus having children and, actually being married and just all this that is nowhere in the tradition of the saints. But a novelist made a good story. And nowadays everybody wants to take everything and pull it down. So it's unfortunate. And we have to be sincere, but we also have to be careful and not just sort of get caught up in popular ideas. That's one of the reasons Swami wrote the book and the way he wrote it. Who has the right to speak? And then we go back. Swami's very orthodox. He's extremely creative, but he's also exceedingly orthodox. It's just like, if this is what Master said, we have to have a really good reason before we change that. We can't just change it because people got together. I was very impressed with some theological group that got together and reviewed the New Testament and then voted about what they thought was true, which parts of it were true. And then if the majority of people thought that this was the meaning of it, then that's what they all agreed was the meaning of it. But Swami says it's preposterous. You can have 1,000 people. I'll give it to you like this. When we were somewhere in Europe on some kind of a pilgrimage trip, Swami was there. And there was a story told in some Italian city. I don't even remember where we were. And it was the story about a consecrated host, the wafer that is given at communion. It's just a piece of bread until it's consecrated. And then when it's consecrated, it becomes a profoundly holy item because it then carries they say it's the body of Christ, but it carries the consciousness of Christ. And, you might want to scoff at that, but very interestingly, as one example, Therese Neumann, whom Master wrote about in Autobiography of a Yogi, she's was a Catholic saint who bore the marks of Christ on her body. And for many years, every Friday, she would relive the crucifixion of Jesus. And she would have the wounds of the crown of thorns and from her hands. And in Autobiography of a Yogi, Master talks about going to see her. One of the interesting characteristics of Teresa Neumann is that she never ate or drank anything. The only thing she could take in was a holy host at communion. But if it wasn't a consecrated wafer, she would immediately reject it. I mean, it was just the piece of bread. But even if it was, because they tested her, if they gave it to her even in the right circumstance, but it wasn't actually consecrated, she couldn't take it in. But if it was consecrated, she could, because something really happened there. I read a biography of Therese Neumann. I think I read several, but she was a wonderful, joyful, light-hearted person. And in the context of the story of her not taking food or water, she would go traveling with her friends. She had a circle of friends, and they would go traveling. And she used to tease them because they always had to stop and eat. And it was so inconvenient. And she, by contrast, was never troubled with the same problems they were troubled with. When you read about her, you really feel the greatness of her spirit and how free and natural she was, far from being pretentious. She was just completely at ease with who she was and what she was. And she had visions all the time. She didn't merely go on Fridays, but they would be doing things, and then suddenly she would shift into a trance, and then everything would stop until she came out. She would often go to Israel at the time of Jesus in her visions, and she would just have experiences, and then she would come back and talk about them. It's really wonderful to read. Highly recommended. So anyway, he said, he was reading about great controversies in Christian theology and realized that without ever studying them, Master had answered them all. Then Swami goes on to say, the issues you touched on in your letter are superficial, meaning whatever complaints she had against what Master did and didn't say. I hope you don't mind my saying so. I would suggest that you tune in to what Yogananda has to say, rather than trying to block him on an intellectual level. And that is something that people do. I'll give you an example, and it was related to Swami, but it's the same principle here. Swami had one of the manuscripts that he'd written, and it was on a particular subject that he thought someone was quite knowledgeable about, and he gave her the manuscript to read. And she was calling me, over several nights, just complaining about this thing that Swami said that wasn't quite accurate, and this wasn't quite accurate, and this was overstated, and why did he say that? Maybe it was just one conversation, but whatever it was just sort of this nitpicking of them. This was a really beautiful manuscript with wonderful ideas, and she kept picking on little bits and pieces of it. And finally, an exasperation, this makes me think it was several conversations, I said, why are you doing this? And somehow the way I spoke to her caught her attention. She answered me honestly, because if he's not wrong, then I'm going to have to start listening to him. And I said, oh, we're talking about fear. Why don't we talk about fear and stop talking about this manuscript? It was just crazy. It was like she was in a personal dilemma of needing to make a decision about whether she was going to allow Swamiji to influence her life or not. And so she was hoping that she could discredit him by picking apart his manuscript, and then she wouldn't have to face that serious issue. So we talked about that, which was a very interesting and helpful conversation about, how do you make such a decision? How do you decide? But you don't make it by finding superficial ways to block the necessity to attune yourself. So Swami says, I would suggest that you tune in to what Yogananda has to say, rather than trying to block him on an intellectual level. And that's a very important point because people do this. Rather than ask him to attune to your thoughts, meaning, but I think this, why don't you agree with me? That's what he means by asking him to attune to my thoughts. But this is an important point and you left it out, and this is an important point and you left it out. That's what he was doing. Rather than asking Master to attune to your thoughts, your growth would be much greater if you were to try to attune yourself to his infinite wisdom. A wisdom not influenced by passing fads, because it is eternal. So concentrate on what Master does have to say, instead of clinging to your preferences about what he should have done. And ask yourself, why am I doing this? Because it's not just what we think, it's why am I so determined to think this? No, we get ourselves into these positions. I was talking to someone a few months ago, and they were about to make what appeared to me a very unfortunate decision. It was in a personal relationship, and there was a profound lack of willingness to trust, to be open and to trust. And because she was talking to me about it, and because I felt that she was about to make a very serious mistake and I didn't want her to make it, I said something about, why are you so reluctant to believe that this person is sincere? Well, I was just raised to be independent. I mean, some of you have heard me say this, and maybe even in this class I said it. I said, how old are you? She said, 59. I said, well, your parents have passed away. You're 59 years old. Like, how much longer are you going to let your childhood dictate your life? So you were raised that way. So I've always been this way. So from an early age, this is what I've always felt. Like, is this a good reason to keep doing it? This sounds to me like a good reason not to die in the same state of consciousness you were born in. But we do this all the time. This is the way I was raised. This is what I've always thought. From a young age, this is what I did. Yeah, when I was 10, I made this decision, and I've never re-examined it. I've had 50 years of life experience, and I'm still clinging to the decision I made when I was 10. There's an expression in India that says it's a blessing to be born into a religion, but a misfortune to die in it. And what that means is, over the course of a lifetime, have you not progressed at all? Do you die with exactly the same understanding that you were born with? So this is what Swami's asking. Think about your motives. Instead of trying to get Master to meet your criteria, why don't you try to understand him? So Swami says, that's the end of the letter, in divine friendship. So this question is asked whether certain saints in India were greater than Yogananda. There's a corollary question here that, somebody asked Swami once, talking about John the Baptist and Jesus. And the question was, if Jesus was so much greater than John the Baptist, why did John the Baptist have any disciples? Why didn't all his disciples just leave and go to Jesus if Jesus was greater? And Swami said, because they were John's disciples. It's not like you shop the market and find the biggest and the bestest guru that you can find. And this is what Swami starts answering here, so let's hear it. Swami says, I'm not in the game of comparing saints. This was written about 1999, by the way. I'm not in the game of comparing saints. As Sri Yukteswar said once to a devotee, why make comparisons? This is how God is playing through you and through me. Swami writes, I have my own mother. She was, in her way, a great woman, but I would not say that she was the greatest possible mother. It doesn't interest me to inquire into the matter. The plain fact is, she was mine. It would have been foolish for me to go looking for a better mother. Master, similarly, is my spiritual mother. I believe he was as great a master as any. But the important thing to me is that he is my master. That is quite sufficient for me. Isn't that beautiful? Of course, you have to have faith in your guru before you come to that state of realization. But you have faith in him because in the great Avatar playoffs, yours hit the home run. It's like, what kind of thinking is that? This is a profound bond of love and friendship, and you have to have faith. So Swami says, I believe Master was as great a master as any, but I follow him because he's mine. I recognized him and I love him. So Swami says, please ask yourself, what is this spiritual search all about that I'm on? Certainly it isn't some spiritual World Series to determine which team is the best. No true master is or can ever be greater than any other. That's what he was saying before. It's an absolute state of consciousness. Eternity, infinity, you don't have like two or three of them lined up and one is a better eternity and the other is a better infinity. You just don't have it like that. It's what is this path that I'm on, really? No true master is or ever can be greater than any other. Their relative greatness can be judged only in the worldly sense, according to the outer roles they play. I once met a great master in India who, so Master told me, was fully liberated, yet his sainthood was unknown even in his own village. He had almost no disciples. I said to him, you have so much to give. Why don't you have more people following you? His reply was, God has done what he wants to do with this body. I mean, that's the avatar. That's the attitude of the true God-realized master. It's just surrendered. There's no competition. One has certain responsibilities. Others do not have those responsibilities. Master had a certain force of energy that needed to express itself. And Lahiri Mahashaya had a very different force. Master made the comment once, and I mean, this is how it was repeated to me, that Lahiri Mahashaya was lucky because during his whole lifetime there was no war. Whereas Master went through the First World War, the Second World War, and the Korean War. And that's very important from the point of view when you realize that the Master's consciousness is as much in everyone as it is in himself. He went through the Spanish flu. He went through just times of enormous trial and suffering for people. And, with his tender heart, and also with all the dissonance that would take place, all the harsh vibrations that he would have felt. We're living, we've begun to live in a very fractured time on the planet. And Master said that there would be very difficult times, and we may be beginning into something that Master predicted 70 years ago would come. This transition from Kali into Dwapara is not a simple transition. I live in Silicon Valley right now, and this whole experience of the COVID pandemic in 2020, it's in one sense I'm in a good place because people are very sensible and are behaving in responsible ways. And the county I live in has been in trouble recently because everybody's in trouble, but the part of the county that I live in is very responsible. And so it's somewhat of a secure place to be. But there's so much tension in the atmosphere where we're living right now because it's densely populated and it's an intense area at all times. And you just feel it. And it's quite different than living in a serene rural area in a long period of peace. It's just completely different. There's enormous economic uncertainty, political uncertainty, survival uncertainty, just tremendous. And you just feel it, all of that happening around you. And Master continually incarnated at times when there was difficulties, and he had to face them. He was William the Conqueror. He was, the name escapes me, but he was the Spanish king also. He was Ferdinand III. He was at war personally in both of those incarnations, himself leading soldiers. It's a certain kind of energy that takes on that kind of experience. Whereas this saint that Swami met, this God-realized master, was just living quietly in a small Indian village. But his state of consciousness was exactly the same as Master's. But God has done what he wants to have done through this body. So it can't be understood with normal human thinking. We have to rise to the level of the avatar before we understand the avatar. So Swami says, the modern mind, especially the modern American mind, thinks that bigger is better. Why should this be so? There's no rivalry in God. In him, all is one. The differences are superficial. If you are really seeking God, don't worry about who is a full avatar, Purna avatar it's called, a full avatar, or even who is even an avatar at all. Many saints who are far less than avatars are perfectly competent to take you to God. And that is what the spiritual path is all about. That's what Swami has written in many different places. Many great saints are perfectly competent to take you to God. You can't just sort of sit on the side and say, I'll only take a Purna avatar, a full avatar. It's our loss, not the loss for the masters. I myself consider Master to be the avatar of this age because I see that his life, mission, and teachings address so many of humanity's actual needs at this time, especially from a standpoint of energy, which is the hallmark of these times we live in. But my devotion to him has nothing to do with this belief. I am perfectly willing that someone else fill that role, if this be God's will. In a sense, I would even prefer it, simply because the beauty of my Guru's life was so much what he was as a person and as a spirit with which I commune in meditation. It's a very important point Swami's making, because he has often said that he feels that Master is the avatar of this age, and he's talked about the important role that Ananda will play in years to come, that the day will come when Master's teachings will essentially define society. He said even if his name is not known, the teachings will be the norm, because we're coming into Dwapara Yuga and we're ascending beyond that. But Swami here makes it very clear that that's not why he's enthusiastic about Master. He's not sort of standing next to him because of the reflected glory of being a direct disciple of the avatar of the age. He's saying it's just that is his perception, given what he understands and what he sees. He said, but it's not a competition. If somebody else turns out to have that role, that's just fine with me. And then Swami says, in many ways he would prefer it, because then that would leave him to relate to Master in the way that truly matters, which is the inward state of consciousness. Swami's not exactly saying it here, but it's also part of it. Because of Swamiji's belief about the importance of Master's mission, it of course has also completely defined Swami's life. Because Swami feels an obligation to carry out his Guru's mission, to finish it, to manifest it, to bring many aspects of it into manifestation. If he were to come to understand that Master really has no such role to play, then Swami himself would take another role. All that he's done with his life is because of his understanding of what Master wanted of him, given what Master came here to do. And this is a role Swami fulfilled in both William's incarnation and also in Ferdinand's incarnation. Swami in both of those cases was the physical son of the man, but he took what his Guru, his father, spiritual father, physical father, started, and then he finished. He brought it out so it would show and carried out things that the Master himself wasn't able to do. In Yogananda's life, Swami started communities, he started the schools, and he wrote many, many books about the practical application of Master's teaching for Dwapara Yuga. But that's not why Swami is Master's disciple. He's Master's disciple because he recognized him and because he feels his spirit in his heart. And everything else is a detail in a certain sense. So then Swami says, great outward roles can be a distraction from this divine intimacy. I try to help fulfill what I believe he wanted of me for the completion, that's the word he was used, I couldn't think of it, for the completion of his mission. But I am content if my understanding of his role should be exaggerated. What does it really matter? It would mean I haven't fully understood the significance of his mission, but it would not mean I have overestimated his divine greatness. You see the difference? You know, Swami recognizes what he has to give spiritually, and he feels that this is what he has to give to the world, but if he's wrong in that, it's a detail. Nor would it mean he couldn't give me what I came to him to receive, which is self-realization. He is my spiritual mother. Outward missions are of secondary importance in the spiritual search. Whatever plan God has for this world is his business. The important thing for me is to come closer to him. I bow with devotion to God's manifestation in all his saints, but I follow my own guru. That he is my guru is quite enough for me. Isn't that just a beautiful, sweet way to look at it? Who's the greatest? Who cares? It's all about, it's a love, it's a relationship, and it's a relationship of love. And just as you can think, you know, in human life, you know, you're interested in this person because he's the CEO of the company, but that person has a higher position and a bigger salary, so I'll go be interested in that person, and then when that person loses his position, I'll go back over here and go to this one. You're just a merchant, you're just a customer shopping in a shop. You're not really loving. Even the same thing, who's the greatest avatar, that's the one I'm going to follow. No, we fall in love. And we fall in love according to God's plan. And then the heart leads after that. In another context, Swami wrote, I have this in Light Bearer, but I don't know where it is in the book. He basically said, some people come to the Guru because they like the teachings, they want the techniques, they're interested in, you know, what he has to offer. He said there's others who come because they're drawn from the heart. He said that's a different order of disciple, the one who's there from the heart, because he's my guru, and that's all that I'm following. I know that to be true. So, now this is to a devotee who doubted the existence of Babaji. Of course, we hear in Autobiography of a Yogi about this Himalayan master who will maintain his body till the end of this cycle of time, who appears whenever he chooses to appear, that can only be seen when he wants the devotees to see him. But anyone who says his name with sincere devotion calls to himself an instant blessing, who lives high in the Himalayas and never ages. It's quite a story. And so, this devotee doubts it. This was written in 1989. And I guess, apparently, this person equated the Yogananda stories about Babaji with Santa Claus. How do you manage to equate Yogananda's accounts of Babaji with your parents' stories about Santa Claus? I assume your parents never claimed to have seen Santa Claus or to have known anyone else to have seen him. Moreover, stories of Santa Claus are not told to children in order to fool them. Myths are often beneficial, and in their influence on people are often truer than mere facts. Swami, that was a theme that Swami often reiterated. He had a very classical education and learned a lot of Greek myths and Roman myths, and he always lamented the fact that children were not raised on those stories anymore, because in the beauty of the characters and the heroism, or the consequences for wrong behavior, and in the acting out of great truths, as Swami said, they're often more true than mere facts. We've become so pedestrian in the way we want to express everything that we don't give ourselves the opportunity for heroism, or to just see things in a magnificent way. And so Swami is saying the story about Santa Claus is it's a beautiful story, about this. Well, it was Saint Nicholas originally, but this wonderful benign being who loves children and who delivers presents to us. It's very exciting. And for little children, appealing to their feelings and awakening their imagination is a very necessary part of holistic development as a person. And we lose a great deal by being so mundane about everything. So anyway, the difference between Babaji and Santa Claus is that all of our masters do claim to have seen him. Disciples I know personally also claim to have seen him. I myself have had experiences of him, though I have never yet been blessed to behold him in vision. The evidence is strong enough, surely, to inspire you to conduct your own tests in the matter, rather than announcing so boldly to others your unseasoned judgment that he is a myth. Oh, Swami's taking a stand here. Really, how arrogant. And Swami's pointing it out. This is just the kind of thing that somebody tries to be sort of shrewd and entertaining. Well, how do you really know Babaji is there? It's just like being told when you're a child there's a Santa Claus. And it makes you sound smart and important and a little cynical. I remember talking to someone once, and I was trying to help this man through a certain mental attitude he had that wasn't helping him. And he confessed that it was very important for him always to appear shrewd and never to be thought gullible. And that's an American characteristic. It's a very interesting experience in America, presenting spiritual teachings to people, because I've had many. This has happened many times where that people would have an experience, through some event that we were putting on or some program, and they would be very deeply moved, and they would really feel something powerful, and they would speak to that. They would speak of what a moving experience it had been, either at the time or later. But then they would go home and think about it, and and then they would begin to worry about what they had experienced, and maybe they shouldn't be so quick to make a decision, and pretty soon they would talk themselves out of it. And in Italy, where people trust their hearts a lot more, when they have a deep experience, they're more inclined to believe that than they're inclined to believe their reasoning about it afterwards. And in India, where they have a generational understanding of spiritual intuition, they just trust it. If they feel that spiritual power, they trust it. And it's a very enjoyable, because it's a very different atmosphere than where Americans are sitting, sort of waiting for you to prove themselves. I haven't had this experience, but Swami said England is the worst of all. So when we talked about giving a talk in England, he said, let's see. He spent the first half of the lecture trying to prove to the audience that he wasn't a charlatan, and the second half trying to prove to them that he wasn't a fool. So after a whole evening of the best effort he could put out, he managed to bring everybody from negative back to zero. He said it was just because the temperament was skeptical and not that feeling in the heart. So, you can see somebody just being clever, comparing Babaji to Santa Claus, not stopping to really consider. See, this is the same one we were talking about before, about whatever it was. Oh, maybe Master was influenced by delusion. Maybe he's not a perfect avatar. Who's the perfect avatar? Who isn't? We're just playing with our minds. We're just intellectualizing, but why are we doing that? Why are we doing that? Because if it's not wrong, then I might have to listen. I mean, always ask yourself, what is my motive? What is someone else's motive when they're trying to tear down? I mean, you can have sincere doubts, have a sincere desire to know. Swami commented when he was speaking on some college campus back east, he said, and he got into a discussion with the students. He said it was very interesting. They were very intelligent, well-educated young people. They asked very good questions. He said that some of the better questions he'd been asked, and he parried all the questions and answered them as well as he could, which was pretty well. He said, but he felt at the end of the evening it wasn't a good use of his time, because he said he didn't feel even one of the people in that room was really going to be inspired to follow the path. He said they would all just go home and, as he said, lick their intellectual wounds and come back tomorrow with more arguments. And that isn't the level on which spiritual teaching can be shared. It's not a debate. And that's why also I was speaking earlier about, scholars and academicians and even theologians, they all get together and they read the scripture and they compare and they decide and they vote and they discuss. That's quite different than having an experience or having a revelation, which is even more profound. So it just depends on who we want to be. It's not that that kind of work has no purpose or no benefit. It's not of interest to me, but I think I've been there and I've done that, and it just didn't satisfy what I really want, which is I want an experience of the heart. And so this is what Swami's speaking to. And so on. This is a very strange sentence in here. And what does it matter whether or not Babaji cuts his toenails? So this person must have said something like that. Well, if he's living, do his fingernails grow? Does he have to cut his nails? That would be the kind of I don't know, but that must have been what the question was. Otherwise, why would Swami say something so preposterous? Meaning, I want all the facts about this. I want all these details. That makes a difference. Like, what difference does it make? But what does it matter whether his nails grow? If he does, he does, and if he doesn't, he doesn't. From some of the things one reads in Yogananda's autobiography, Babaji's body may be subtler than our normal physical bodies, though capable of grosser manifestation. Sri Yukteswar, for instance, failed to see Babaji standing behind the sunbeams. But such details are, I think, not pertinent to the sincere devotee. It's interesting to me in a couple of stories about Babaji, especially the first one that's told, an early one that's told in Autobiography of a Yogi, where Lahiri Mahashaya, just coming down from the mountains, stops to visit friends or acquaintances, and he tells them about his experience of meeting the remarkable Babaji, and they're skeptical. And Babaji has told Lahiri that he will come to Lahiri whenever Lahiri calls him. So Lahiri wants to prove that this Babaji really exists. So in this story and autobiography, Lahiri goes into an interior room and closes the door, lays out a clean blanket, prays to Babaji, and Babaji manifests, and he's sitting there. And then Babaji slightly scolds his disciple and says, why are you bringing me for a trifle? These are skeptical people, and if they'll only believe if they see me, this is not appropriate. And so then Babaji says, after this I will come whenever you need me, not whenever you call. And of course it was a divine play between them. However, two things that are really touching. Babaji says basically, but I don't want to embarrass you in front of your friends. So, let's open the door and let's show them that I'm really here. And then he asks them to cook food for him. And in a couple of other stories I've read, Babaji asked people to cook food for him. So what is the effect of their cooking food? They bring the food to him, he sits down and he eats it. I mean, he's just showing them that I'm really here, that I'm not just evanescent, I'm not just a vision, I'm not just a shimmering sort of protoplasm there. I'm sitting at your table and I'm eating the halwa that you made for me. So on that level, there is a physicality to him. eating food, and he's showing that he has a physical body like anyone else. But what difference does it make? It's not pertinent to the sincere devotee. When I met Yogananda, I had many doubts that I determined to put on the shelf for the time being, since I was in no position to resolve them. In time, they were resolved indeed. The most important lesson I learned, however, was that doubt itself is a spiritual disease, and the only cure for it is divine love. I pray that you grow daily in devotion. So we think, if I just get this one question answered, if I just need to know this one thing, and once I get that clear, then I'm going to be fine. But Swami says, no, that's the way the mind plays and keeps true spiritual life. We hold it at arm's length by always just throwing up just one more question. I would happily follow this, but Yogananda didn't really answer properly on this question over here, so I'm not really sure I can trust him. No, we have to just put a lot of things on the shelf. When Vivekananda was asked, Swami Vivekananda was asked, why did God make the world, or a question like that, he answered, the level of consciousness which would think to ask that question would not be capable of understanding the answer. Which is kind of a non-answer, but it's also very interesting. Which is, if you want to know why God behaves the way he behaves, you have to have God realization. Because until then, the mind can't comprehend on the level that it's actually happening. And so that when we ask, that's why Swami said you put it on the shelf, because there's no way I can understand this at this point, but we go forward with what we do know. When I remember I remember lots of things that Swami said that I really couldn't understand. It wasn't so much in the realm of philosophy, but Swami would say things primarily, make statements, just about life, about people, about lots of things that I couldn't figure out what to do with it. And I didn't want to, I respected him too much to reject it, and I respected myself too much to accept it without understanding. So I did exactly what Swami did. I put it on the shelf. I had just this compartment in my mind, which was like this inaccessible. I lived in a dome at one point, and I had a closet where, because of the shape of the dome, there were just parts of the closet shelf that were really hard to get to, and then I just had a mental picture. That's where I put lots of things that Swami set up on those shelves, because I didn't want them right in the center of my experience. I couldn't throw them away, but I couldn't deal with them. It was like having a dress that doesn't fit you or something like that. I just wanted it out of the way. But over the years, and certain things have taken years, every one of those things has gradually resolved. But I couldn't understand it until I changed. I couldn't have just sat there and rejected Swami because I couldn't understand this. That's what Swami said. He put certain things on the shelf. Thinking back over my early years with Swamiji, this is the picture that I gradually came to. This was after about 10 years, when I'd been on the path long enough to have some perspective. I realized, and most of you know this, when I met Swami, I recognized him instantly as my teacher, as my pole star, as I put it. And I never have wavered from that thought, really. Just have never wavered. I've always, it's by the grace of God, it's just always been a fact. And I acted on that as quickly as I could, and I've acted on it through my whole life. But looking back on those first years, I realized that my head was such a scramble. I had so much energy in my brain and so many different thoughts and so many just unformed ideas, and just in so many ways I just didn't know how to tie my shoes spiritually. There was just so much confusion. But I had an absolute, just rock solid commitment to Swamiji and faith in what he was giving me and Master through him. That Master was guiding the ship and Swami was his instrument. And that it never crossed my mind to doubt that. Everything spun around it, but I just stuck with what I knew. And what I didn't know, I just put off to the side until it clarified itself. And everything did. I mean, it could have happened in a different way. It could have gradually, those doubts could have overtaken that certainty, but it went the other way. The certainty gradually dissolved the doubts. But if I had, and I won't even call them doubts. I would just say the incomprehensibles, because they were just incomprehensible. Just like Swami said, you put them on the shelf because you just don't know what to do with them. But the incomprehensibles might have grown, and instead they shrank. But if I had sat there waiting, or let every incomprehensible challenge what I did know to be true, I trusted my intuition, in other words. I trusted my fundamental experience and figured everything else would straighten itself out, which it did. And that's why Swami says spiritual doubt is a kind of disease. And you can't let it rule your life, because it will take away the good things you do have. And yes, it takes courage, it takes experience, it takes determination to let the incomprehensibles not derail you. But it's a practice deeply worth cultivating. And I will add, and I will remind you of what I said, it wasn't that in any way I suspended my own judgment. I just recognized that my judgment was not infallible. And I never let go of it. Swami's phrase about himself was, he said he followed Master unhesitatingly, but not unquestioningly. There's a big difference. I mean, I asked questions about everything, and everything I didn't understand, I persevered in trying to understand it. But I knew the limits of my own ability, and I had enough sense to realize that it's not that I can't understand it, it's that I don't understand it yet. And then I would have to wait. And it all worked itself out. Okay, so we'll start in on this letter, but we probably won't finish. This was 2001. A devotee wrote, this one is called How Masters Come to Earth. A devotee wrote, which I've said that about 3 times, haven't I? This is the summary of the letter that Swami's answering. A devotee wrote to Swamiji, St. Francis and Therese Neumann say they had visions of Christ's birth and that he didn't have a physical birth, but manifested as light. Were these true visions? What about other avatars like Krishna and Yogananda? Swami says, my first reaction upon reading your question was, who knows? I certainly couldn't say for sure. Since that's not all that enlightening an answer, though, why don't I at least share a few thoughts that suggest themselves? Your question is interesting in that it's easy to get pulled off into an unreasonable extreme one way or the other if one doesn't appreciate the truth of both sides. I'm sure that those visions reported by St. Francis and Therese Neumann were true. Just what were they saying, though? Master once told us, I see all of you as images of light, everything. These trees, bushes, the grass you are standing on, all are made of that light. You have no idea how beautiful everything is. He was describing a reality deeper than the physical one we could see. He wasn't saying, though, that the material world we beheld didn't exist, simply that it wasn't what it appears to be. You see how beautifully comprehensive that is? That's what Swami means when he says that Master resolved so many issues that people argue about. Is the material world real? Is it just a dream? And Master doesn't address it in great philosophical terms, but He looks at the material world and he sees the light that's behind it. But does that mean that there's no material manifestation? Or does it just mean that he sees what is manifesting the material world? I can't be certain of these things, as I said, but my best understanding is that the visions you mentioned are likely to have been similar in nature, seen with inner vision, of course. Christ's birth certainly did appear quite different from that of an ordinary person. It was the deeper reality which drew the wise men to the manger. Why would those wise men have traveled all the way from India just to meet a little baby burbling away? It was this is something that is an important thing to bear in mind. A physical body is small, but the soul doesn't get small just because the physical body is small. If you think of it in common sense terms, when this little girl asked Swamiji how old he was, because he appeared to be as old as her grandfather, but his spirit was not like her grandfather. So she was about 8. She just walked up to him, put her face right close to his and said, "How old are you anyway?" She was a girl in our school, so she had some context for the answer Swami gave. Swami said, "Well, I'll just put it to you like this." He always addressed children very straight. He never talked to them as children. He just talked to them as people in an appropriate way. He said, "Well, I'll put it to you like this. When you were an old woman, I was a little boy." And she sort of stared at him for a minute, and then it clicked into her mind, and she was quite content with that answer. So that which is a little baby today was an old woman or an old man. It could have been very powerful old woman or old man. Just because they're a baby doesn't mean the intelligence, the talent, the consciousness isn't fully there. What the baby lacks is the capacity to communicate in words, to control the body, to move himself about. But everything that he is in consciousness is present. So when an avatar is born, the full avatar's consciousness is there. It's just acting through the baby's body for now, because that's what it is to come into human form. So when the wise men arrived, whom Master said were the three, Babaji, Lahiri, and Sri Yukteswar, and they're communing with the spirit of Jesus, the fact that his body was so tiny didn't mean anything to them. So when St. Francis goes back in time or has a vision of the birth of Jesus, he sees the divine light being born. And the physical body it's in is incidental to that. So he reports that Jesus was born as pure light because he was. But it doesn't mean that he wasn't also born as a baby, because he was physical. But this isn't to say that the birth didn't have a physical reality much the same as other births. The great ones make a point of acting out in their own lives most of the outward drama through which the rest of us have no choice but to pass. Like Christ on the cross, they could do otherwise, but they choose not to. It's in condescending to live out these scenes that they make the examples of their lives real and meaningful to us, and encourage us with the thought that, as they have overcome, so can we. Master writes about this in several places, about Jesus and about all avatars. He said, what would it serve humanity if some form descends and is not bound by any of the laws or rules or necessities or demands or heartbreaks or challenges that a human being has to go through? Then we think, wow, that's really spectacular. But the problem of my life is still exactly the same, because I haven't actually seen an example of someone who knows how to live in this world in the right way. The way I think about it sometimes is that we're all in a maximum security prison, and so we're all confined and bound by certain more or less arbitrary rules. I've visited a friend who was in maximum security prison for a long time, and there were all kinds of rules that just bound him. And then when I would go in to visit, I was also bound by those rules. I couldn't walk out and I couldn't just do the things that I would normally do because I was inside that prison with him. And of course, when he went deeper into the prison beyond the visitor's room, All these other rules were imposed on him. But that's what it is to be a human being. We're in a kind of maximum security lockdown. And the avatar puts himself in prison, puts himself in the maximum security place, and has to follow all the same rules, because that's what it is to be on the material plane and be a human being. But the avatar shows us how we can, even under those conditions, how we can transcend all limitations. And it's powerfully meaningful to us because he is there with us. If he were just directing us from the outside, it wouldn't be the same experience as when he's standing there with us. So this is how Swami writes, the great ones make a point of acting out in their own lives most of the outward drama through which the rest of us have no choice but to pass. They could do otherwise, but they choose not to. It's in living out these scenes that they make the example of their lives real and meaningful to us, and to encourage us with the thought that as they have overcome, so can we. God bless you, my friend.